Hi, Comrade Haidar, can you hear me?
Yes, yes. Hi, Sia.
Yes, yes,
Hi.
Comrade. How are
Hi,
you?
how are you doing?
I'm good,
How's
I'm
it?
good. No, great. Okay, I think we should start. It's 1 minute past one now.
Okay.
Um, so and this is I think this is our first webinar series for the Israel Apartheid Week. And we are so grateful to host you for this opening webinar, because there was a program yesterday, a face-to-face program that took place in Gauteng. But however, the purpose for today is to talk about the Oslo virus, and what do you specifically mean when you talking about de-Osloizing the Palestinian mind? And I'm glad there's that picture behind you, because he also makes the point that de-Osloization has created this normalization, and as it has come to be called, and that we've seen greater events, the Palestinian Liberation Organization taking part in it as well, without first ending the occupation, but it has just normalized the occupation. So this is what I want us to talk about today. And this is how this has also created and has opened up Israel to the world, and how Israel has built relationship with the European Union, the OECD, and how foreign direct investment after this has came in. So that's the purpose of today, just to discuss what do you mean by de-Osloization and the fight against normalization. So, Comrade Haid, I'm gonna give to you, and then you can introduce yourself and then take us through.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you so much, Comrade Sia. It is an honor to be joining you. And, I want to say, well, I'm here in Palestine, but I'm also there in South Africa. I'm sure you know Comrade Sia and all other comrades who have joined us now know very well that I also have a South African citizenship. I spent some time in South Africa. In fact, I spent about between 5 and 7 years in South Africa, and I got my PhD degree from UJ, the University of Johannesburg. And I'm also very glad that we are opening the Israeli Apartheid Week activities here, even in Gaza. We are opening it with you in South Africa jointly. And this is very important for us because I think people in Palestine have begun to understand the meaning of apartheid. We have been talking about it for a while now, and we have been making that comparison, the apartheid South Africa Israel analogy, and the relationship between the anti-apartheid movement and the Palestinian nationalist movement. And you have, Sia, you have chosen a very, very controversial topic, in fact, something that, as you mentioned, Edward Said talked about, criticized. I myself have been talking about this for a while, with a long list of Palestinian, even international and even South African intellectuals criticizing the approach taken by the leadership, the official right-wing leadership of the Palestinian people. Let me open with a quote from one of our role models here in Palestine, a South African role model, Steve Biko. Steve Biko, made so many statements, of course, and he's one of the founders, or rather the founder of the Black consciousness movement in South Africa. And one of my favorite quotes is his Fanonian statement about, the mind of the oppressed. And that will be, my opening remark about, the Osloization, because I need to define what we mean by Osloization. People who don't know, what Oslo Accords were all about, I need to explain that, and then move to De-Osloization as part of the decolonization of the Palestinian mind. So that quote is, the most potent weapon in the hands of the oppressor is the mind of the oppressed. I have been, unquote, and I have been talking about Steve Biko to my students, to my comrades here in Palestine, in Gaza. I'm talking to you, of course, from Gaza. And I think this quote, in a way, sums up also apartheid Israel's expectation of the Palestinian people, colonizing the Palestinian mind in so many different ways. But also it sums up our response to Israel's attempt to colonize the Palestinian mind. Part of that process of colonization of the Palestinian mind is the Oslo Accords, Osloization of the Palestinian mind, which takes us to what you asked me to talk about, the process of normalization, normalizing apartheid in Palestine, normalizing, occupation, normalizing oppression. And I think, normalizing oppression has always been one of the tools used by the colonizer against the resistance of the oppressed and the colonized, to make us believe that we are inferior and that we have to accept whatever crumbs of bread, as Desmond Tutu says, whatever crumbs of bread they throw to us. Be it a ghetto in parts of the West Bank, or a concentration camp in the Gaza Strip. We have to accept that and be very grateful to them. But they have to create that oppressed Palestinian who is grateful. And this process of, normalizing oppression, etc., it turns native against native. That native who accepts oppression, normalizes it, accepts his and her inferior status, and then tries to force the other native who doesn't accept it, it tries to force him or her to accept it. And this is exactly what has been going in the Arab world, in Palestine in particular, since the signing of the Oslo Accords. In fact, even before that, since the signing of the Camp David agreement in the late 70s between Egypt and apartheid Israel. And all the oppressor does while normalizing oppression is just sit and watch how native is fighting against native. Britain, France, America, apartheid South Africa, with the experience of the Bantustans and the tribal chiefs of the Bantustans, are just a few, actually, of the colonizers who used that normalizing process, who used it as a tool of dominance. And this is why they privileged one sector of the colonized population, like what is happening right now in Palestine. We have sectors of the Palestinian people. Palestinians who are second-class citizens of the State of Israel. And then you have Palestinians of the West Bank. And then you have Palestinians who live in the diaspora. whether in Europe, in the West, or, you know, or even in refugee camps in Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, you name it, or those who live in the Gaza Strip, like myself. And therefore, colonizers use it as a tool of, as I said, of dominance. They privilege one sector of the colonized population by offering them some crumbs of the master's table, which then makes them willing, I would call them propagandists, you know, from the word propaganda, propagandists, who sing the praise of and justify colonization and oppression and the colonizers' civilizing mission. Israel came to Palestine, or rather Zionists, early Zionists came to Palestine claiming that Palestine is, you know, a land without a people for a people without land. Palestine was a desert for them, and it worked. They convinced the oppressed Jews in Europe that God promised them to come back, to return to the promised land. And this is why I think apartheid does it very well, does it exactly the same way apartheid South Africa did it, Britain did it, France did it in Algeria, and Britain in India, etc. The civilizing mission. But the point here is in Israel's case, with the unending aid from the United States of America, which itself is a settler colony, Israel has been able to dispossess us, the Palestinian people, while portraying itself as, you know, a modern Western country surrounded by Arab and Muslim savages who it oppresses as a favor to protect Western interests in the Middle East. That's it. That is what is happening. And unfortunately, some people buy it. Some people buy that argument. And of course, my point, coming back to the, you know, to the Osloized intellectuals, is that there's no shortage of civilized Arab natives, you know, in United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, Morocco, Egypt, and even in Palestine, no shortage of those civilized Arab natives whom we call janissaries, almost slaves, who can appreciate Israel's modernity, Israel's democracy, exactly like white democracy under apartheid, white modernity under apartheid, and most importantly, its generosity. Israel is generous, giving us, you know, autonomy, administrative autonomy, like, you know, Oslo Accords. We have to be grateful. Israel was very generous by offering us that, by offering us, in fact, some of our basic rights, And therefore, I think the haspara is a Hebrew word for, you know, propaganda in a way, propaganda. The haspara machine of Israel is able to create here two categories of Arabs. All right, so here you have two categories, like two categories of Africans, you know, the leaders of the Bantustans and those troublemakers, the likes of Nelson Mandela, Steve Biko, Desmond Tutu, etc., Neville Alexander, etc. So here you have two categories of Arabs and Palestinians, the grateful and the ungrateful. The grateful and the ungrateful. So on the one hand, you have the Uncle Toms, the good Arab, the grateful good Arab, whose ultimate goal is to appease the Israeli master, or those who support him, the Western powers, of course, who support the Israeli master, the Western power. So we have to appease Western powers and we have to appease the Israeli masses. And then we become grateful, good Muslims, good Arabs, good Palestinians, etc., etc. Those natives, we call them sellout. You in South Africa understand what I'm talking about. You had that kind under apartheid. You had a different way of dealing with them. I'm not going to allude to that now, but definitely we call them sellout by, we, us Palestinians and Arabs. This is what we call the leaders of the United Arab Emirates. This is what we call the leaders of Morocco. But we have to understand that these normalizers are not inherently normalizers. They are not inherent normalizers, but they begin to start showing symptoms of being normalizers while vehemently denying that they are normalizers. This is what is happening. If you say you are a normalizer, I say, no, we are not normalizers. We resist Israeli occupation. We resist Israeli colonization. We resist Israeli apartheid, but we have our own approach. But they don't call it normalization. They deny that they are normalizers of oppression and colonization. And in fact, I'm thinking, the best, or the first example that comes to my mind was, is Anwar Sadat of Egypt, the late president of Egypt. I'm thinking also about Qatari officials from Qatar who regularly visit Israel, who have projects in Gaza, but in order to reach Gaza, they have to get a permission from the Israeli master, from the Israeli occupier. I'm thinking also of course, Emirati and Bahraini and Saudi emirs and officials who do not shy away from meeting and even taking selfies with Israeli war criminals, and even boast about that. They show off, they boast that, they have Israeli friends, Israeli war criminals. Leaders of Israel are war criminals, the likes of Benjamin Netanyahu. I'm also thinking of some Palestinians. I mean, we shouldn't deny that. Some Palestinians who defend, for example, security coordination with apartheid Israel. Those who believe that, life is all about negotiations and negotiations and negotiations. And resistance is futile. They say it. They say it. This is the kind of, normalizers that I'm thinking about, or Osloized, politicians. They say that, notwithstanding the fact that Zionism is an we need to define it, ethno-religious ideology rooted in aggressive exclusion of the others, not unlike apartheid. Those who are excluded are, yes, Arabs, but also including good Arabs, the Janissaries, the Osloized Arabs. And the list also includes, and since we are talking about normalization, I think this list that I have just mentioned now, that I have alluded to, also includes artists and civil society organizations and some intellectuals, some academics who normalize for very selfish reasons, exactly like those artists and academics who in the 70s and 80s normalized with the apartheid system of South Africa, only to boost their careers and get more wealth. I cannot think about any other reasons about those artists and intellectuals who normalize with apartheid Israel. Now, ironically enough, there are those who normalize but claim that they don't know what normalization is all about. They don't know the definition of normalization, nor have they any knowledge of, the definition, the agreed upon definition of the term. based on our definition, when I say our, I'm referring to us as Palestinian civil society sectors and political organizations. And we have been, talking about it. We have been, talking to media about it, posting it on social media, etc., etc. But sometimes you meet those people who tell you we don't know what normalization is, and this is why in 2007 we decided to come up with a definition. Since people ask us what is the definition of normalization, and since I'm referring to the topic of this webinar is, Osloization, etc. I will limit myself to the definition of normalization within the Arab and Palestinian context. The Arab or Palestinian normalization for us comes as a stab in the back of the Palestinian people. And we defined it as normalization as participation in any project, initiative or activity in Palestine, in the Arab world, or internationally that aims to bring together Arabs and Israelis without, and that is the point. So there is a condition, without placing this act, placing as its goal resistance. It has to come up with the context of resistance, or rather co-resistance, and exposure of the Israeli occupation and all forms of discrimination and oppression against the Palestinian people. Israel's oppression of Palestinians is multi-tiered. You have direct military occupation of the Gaza Strip and the West Bank. You have apartheid not only in the Gaza Strip and the West Bank, even inside Israel itself, against its second, if not third class Palestinian citizens of the state of Israel. And then you have this ongoing process of ethnic cleansing. In fact, what has been going to us, what Israel has been doing to us here in Gaza is, as my friend, Comrade Ilan Pape, the courageous Israeli historian, calls it, is an incremental genocide. Israel has been imposing a deadly medieval siege on the Gaza Strip since 2007. Since 2007, interrupted with 3 massive genocidal wars in 2009, 2012, and 2014, ultimately leading to the deaths of more than 4,000 civilians. Not to mention the killing of children and women during the Great March of Return in 2017 and 18. That has all been normalized by, Arab and Palestinian normalizers. So, and in spite of this, the almost near consensus amongst Palestinians and Arabs on rejecting the treatment of Israel as, as a normal state with which business as usual can be conducted, you still get those who argue otherwise. And that is what we are talking about. Those are the people that we call, normalizers, Osloized. And now I want, because I know some of the attendees might not be familiar with the Oslo Accords, what exactly happened? Why did the leadership of the Palestinian people, the official leadership of the Palestinian people, of the PLO, Palestine Liberation Organization, why did it decide to sign that deal, those accords with apartheid Israel back in 1993? And I think, if you allow me, this is really important. We need to contextualize, and in order to understand, the Oslo Accords and the extreme damage that they have caused to the Palestinian people, the Palestinian cause in general, we need to put it within a historical context. We have to have a sort of a historical contextualization of the so-called peace process. look, I have had so many discussions with South African comrades, very good comrades, from whom I've learned so many lessons, so many things, honestly. And, one of the problems that I found, or rather they found, is that why did that happen? I mean, why did, we always believed in the leadership of the Palestinian people. They couldn't understand. And I understand why they don't understand. Yeah, sure. And this is why we need to put the Oslo Accords. So we need to talk about Osloization with reference to the Oslo Accords signed between the right-wing leadership of the PLO, the Palestine Liberation Organization, and apartheid Israel, in order to understand what I mean by the term I coined, de-Osloization, as part of a process of decolonization of the Palestinian mind. And I think this understanding of, the historical context of the Oslo Accords is a very necessary and important step towards the topic of our webinar, de-Osloization. And the process of Osloization, and actually what it means, actually judging by our experience with those accords since they were signed in 1993 until today, what we have witnessed, and I'm exercising self-critique here as a Palestinian. I believe that the PLO is the sole legitimate representative of the Palestinian people, but it needs to be reformed. It has been hijacked, definitely. It has been hijacked. And this is why I'm looking at this from a self-critique perspective. And for us, Osloization has meant a combination of corruption, NGOization, where, revolutionary organizations have been transformed into, Western-funded NGOs, non-governmental organizations. So you have corruption, a combination of corruption, NGOization, and at the same time, selling out of revolutionary principles. When in the 60s, the contemporary Palestinian revolution emerged, January 1965, the slogans were very clear. Return of Palestinian refugees, and justice. Liberation. For us, nobody now uses the word liberation. People are talking, leadership is talking about, negotiations, peace process, etc., in order to establish a Bantustan on parts of historic Palestine. So what happened to the original slogans of the Palestinian revolution? Liberation and return. Gone, evaporated, gone with the wind. So you have this combination of corruption, NGOization of the Palestinian revolutionary forces, including the Palestinian left, selling out of revolutionary principles, all of this fused, combined with the fiction of the two-state solution. You people of South Africa refused. You refused to accept, Bantustans. You never recognized the infamous Bantustans of South Africa. You asked the international community never to recognize those Bantustans. Now, unfortunately, our leadership, right and left, have decided to accept a racist solution. The two-state solution is a racist solution par excellence. Two states for two peoples. For us, we accept, according to the Palestinian leadership, we accept an independent Palestinian state on only 22% of historic Palestine. For us, unfortunately, because of Oslo, that is the solution. Now, that is part of the process of the Osloization of the Palestinian mind. But I think this process of Osloization, dialectically speaking, on the one hand, yes, corruption, enjoyization, selling out of revolutionary principles, but on the other hand, from a dialectical perspective, this process has been dealt a heavy blow in, for example, in 2006 elections, when the Palestinians of Gaza and the West Bank went to the polling station and they voted against the two-state solution. They didn't vote for Hamas because they supported Hamas. No, they wanted to punish the Osloized Palestinian leadership. And they voted against the two-state solution. And then you had the rise of the BDS movement and revival of ideas of liberation and secular democracy in historic Palestine. The media doesn't talk about that. The media doesn't talk about those intellectuals who follow in the steps of the likes of Edward Said. You mentioned Edward Said, Comrade Sia. Edward Said was one of the intellectuals who wrote so many articles about the alternative to the two-state solution, the alternative to Oslo, and that alternative is a secular, democratic state in the historic land of Palestine, a secular, democratic state a la South Africa. All right? End of racism, equality, liberation, return of the Palestinian refugees who were ethnically cleansed by Zionist militias in 1948. I myself, I am a refugee. I'm a son of refugees who were ethnically cleansed in 1948 from the village of Zarnuga. Both my parents died in 2005. I was not in Gaza at the time. I couldn't attend their funeral, thanks to Israel's siege of Gaza and occupation. But I tell you, they died dreaming of the day when they would return to the village of Zarnuga. Unfortunately, that didn't happen, but I will do it. I want my right. Now, that is not part of the Oslo Accord. My parents' dream is not part of the Oslo Accords. And I think, you know, just to go back to the Oslo Accords and Osloization, the topic of our webinar, you know, judging by statements made not only by PA officials, but also, and that is the sad part, by parts of the Palestinian left and even the Hamas government here in Gaza, that, you know, the ultimate goal of, I would call it, you know, the river of blood in Gaza, in particular in Gaza, it has been going on since, I mean, suffering upon suffering upon suffering, blood, you know, river of blood, Gaza and the West Bank. Still, the ultimate goal for those parts of the Palestinian left, for the official leadership of the PLO, and even for Hamas, who has ended up accepting the solution, is the establishment of a Palestinian state in any dimension. That is to say, the two-state solution, Bantustanization of Palestine. It is sad to say that, yeah. But, you know, the contradiction here that I really find it contradictory, the contradiction between the tremendous international support we are getting from civil society, comrades from South Africa, including some governments in Latin America, Bolivia under Comrade Evo Morales, you know, Venezuela. We are getting all that tremendous support. So we have a sort of contradiction between this international support, rise of the BDS movement, you know, demonstrations all over the world in support of the Palestinian struggle against apartheid Israel and its war crimes when it was attacking Gaza in 2009, 2014, 2012, etc., against its war machines and war crimes. The ICC resolution, International Criminal Court, last week, you what happened during the Great March of Return, all of this on the one hand, and the reiteration by most political organizations here in Palestine of, reiteration of the two-state mantra, on the other hand, is actually a strong, I believe, indication of the need for an alternative program. And this is what we are working on here in Gaza. I am part of the one-state campaign. I am a BDS activist. The slogans of the BDS movement, all of you are BDS activists, know very well. Freedom, equality, justice. That is not part of the Oslo Accords. That is part of the de-Osloization of the whole process. I am part of the one-state campaign that calls for the establishment of a secular democratic state in Palestine after, decolonizing Palestine. That is what we are working on right now. And I think all of this program, this alternative program I'm talking about, which is de-Osloization, it makes the process of de-Osloization of Palestine, its first priority. That is our first priority. Decolonizing, de-Osloizing the Palestinian mind. And this is why I began by quoting the late martyr, who's a role model for us here in Palestine, Comrade Steve Biko. Steve Biko, we memorize his statements, heart and mind, of course. And that is exactly what I'm talking about when I say de-Osloization, decolonization, decolonizing the Palestinian mind is a precondition for decolonizing the land. You cannot decolonize Palestine with a colonized mind. It doesn't work. It doesn't work. It didn't work in South Africa under the apartheid system, didn't work in Algeria, and it's not working here in Palestine. Notice that when the Oslo Accords were signed, they were claimed, those who signed the Accords are still alive, who signed the Oslo Accords, and those who support the Oslo Accords, still they claim that, the first accords were, when they were signed, they were, and I'm quoting them, the first step towards an independent state, notice, that was supposed to be declared according to the Accords in 1999. In 1999, we were supposed to have our own independent homeland. It rings a bell. I know my South African comrades understand what I'm talking about. Independent homeland. We were supposed to have it in 1999. It did not happen. Now it is clear. So 28 years after, the handshake on the White House lawn between the chairman of the PLO at the time, the late Yasser Arafat, and the Prime Minister of Israel, Yitzhak Rabin, and his aide, Minister of Foreign Affairs, Shimon Peres at the time, very famous handshake. Since then, no state in the short run will be established because, as Edward Said, all right, as Edward Said argued very convincingly and eloquently, because of the mere fact that Oslo simply ignored the existence of the Palestinian people as a people. As a people. Israel recognized the PLO as the representative of the Palestinian people, whereas the PLO recognized Israel as a state and its right to exist, as if states have right to exist or do not have rights to exist. And, so I think, to claim that Oslo was a great missed opportunity and breakthrough and the peace process was on track, that is all deliberate distortion of reality, claimed in order to prepare us Palestinians for more Osloization, i.e. more concessions to give to apartheid Israel. So what has been created is just a limited administrative autonomy we have here in Gaza and Palestine. Gaza has been transformed into the largest concentration camp on earth. open air prison. I'm not sure whether I should go on or I should stop. Sia, you can
I'm
interrupt me.
worried about time. I'm worried about time. So
Yes,
I
yes,
think we should stop here and take some
sure,
few hands. But
sure.
thank you for clearing that up. And I mean, for most of us, we don't understand, and we still don't understand why would a liberation movement sign these concessions. And it still doesn't make sense how we still find ourselves in this situation. Um, and I mean, this has created great opportunities with Israel to trade freely with other countries, and thanks to this Oslo Accord. And it makes sense now when you say we need to Osloize the minds of people, and we need to fight against the normalization. And as Edward said, also he is always, he as one of the people who didn't understand these. I mean, how can you sign um, this normalization deal without first ending occupation? And that still lingers within our mind. So I'll now start taking questions by a good show of hands, comrades. But there's also already a question from Salim Var, who's saying, fantastic presentation as usual, Comrade Haidar. You are very familiar with solidarity organizations in South Africa. Could you tell us, from the perspective of someone from Gaza, what are our priorities should be? And there's also a question from an anonymous attendee asking, didn't Hamas win the elections? And I think you've covered this question. Didn't Hamas win the last democratic election? And how can PLO be the sole representative? Isn't that one of the problems with the struggle in Palestine? So those are the questions so far, Comrade Haida. And if we can just keep a short response to them so that we
Yeah.
can take a few more hands.
Okay, of course, thank you, Salim. I really appreciate it. Salim is a very good comrade of mine and a role model, in fact. We've learned a lot from Salim and from other comrades in South Africa. I think, to answer Salim's question, I think, South Africa, we are expecting South Africa actually to lead the global BDS movement because, of course, you are heeding our call. You expected the international community as oppressed, as the oppressed South Africans under the apartheid system in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. Well, I think, the first BDS call came out I think in the late 50s, either 58 or 59, by a handful of ANC activists in England, in London, called in the international community to boycott apartheid, divest from it, and from companies benefiting from its oppression of the indigenous population of South Africa, and impose sanctions against apartheid until it complied with international law. It took the international community more than 30 years to heed the call made by the oppressed of South Africa. In the Palestinian case, actually, we issued our call for BDS. The academic and cultural boycott call came out in 2004, but the BDS call came in 2005. So we are talking about 15 to 16 years only, and we've already achieved so many things as a BDS movement thanks to the lessons we've learned from you people of South Africa. We've learned a lot from your experience. We've learned a lot not to bank. When we issued our call, for example, we understood that we shouldn't, bank or count on governments. We should be addressing, civil society sectors, civil society organizations, who in their turn would exert pressure on their governments to boycott apartheid. And that is what we've learned. I mean, if your call came out in the late 50s, Nelson Mandela was released in 1990. Apartheid collapsed in 1994. In the Palestinian case, we want the international, we want to move from, the B and D, from boycott, divestment to sanctions. We want the international community, we want Security Council, we want the United Nations to start, imposing sanctions against apartheid Israel and companies and entities benefiting from its oppression of the Palestinian people. But as South Africans, and I'm South African, I'm Palestinian and South African as well. Actually, I keep asking myself, why does post-apartheid South Africa, why does it maintain diplomatic, economic ties with apartheid Israel? I mean, I find that, very problematic. And I think what you people, civil society in South Africa, what you should be doing, you should be exerting more pressure on the ANC government. By the way, I raised the same point with Comrade Ronnie Castles, for example, a very close comrade of the Palestinian people. And he was a minister. And to tell you the truth, and I think people don't understand here in Palestine why official South Africa, post-apartheid South Africa, still maintains relationships with apartheid Israel. Yes, sometimes, they have problems. They call they withdraw the ambassador. That's not enough. No diplomatic ties with apartheid Israel whatsoever, especially South Africa. And this is why, due to the moral, moral status that you enjoy as South Africans, we want you to lead this global BDS campaign, and you are doing very well. I must say, you are doing very well, but we are expecting more. We are expecting more. We want to have, free entry to South Africa. Why should we apply for visas as Palestinians, as oppressed Palestinians? I mean, you are our comrades. Your ministers are supposed to be our comrades. All of them come from this long history of, anti-apartheid, etc., etc., etc. And I think it's time for post-apartheid South Africa to sever all diplomatic ties with apartheid Israel. That is the least we are expecting from post-apartheid South Africa. The BDS coalition, South African BDS coalition, is doing a great job, coordinating activities, leading, the Israeli Apartheid Week activities. We really appreciate that. As for the second question, because I have to keep my answers short, I'm sorry. As for the second question, yeah, Hamas won the elections in 2006, about 60%. They got about 60% of the vote, etc. And then the problem with Hamas is that after winning the elections, people voted for Hamas because there was no other alternative to the Palestinian Authority and to Fatah at the time. That was January 2006. And people wanted to punish, as I told you, I've already answered this question. People voted not because they wanted to vote for Hamas. And I know so many people who voted for Hamas without being supporters of Hamas, because they wanted to punish the Fatah organization. They wanted to punish the Palestinian Authority at the time. And people, whether consciously or unconsciously, understood that we would not be allowed to have an independent Palestinian state on 22% of historic Palestine, as we had been promised. And this is why they wanted to vote against the so-called two-state solution. Now, we are supposed to have new elections in May. And I'm going to tell you what I think. I am one of the 39% of the Palestinians of the Gaza Strip and the West Bank who are not going to join the elections. I am not going to the polling station in May this year. I did not vote in 2006, and I did not vote in 1996, and I will never vote as long as I am expected to vote under the barrel of the gun of the occupier. How am I supposed to have free elections under occupation? under conditions of colonization, under oppression. Where is my freedom here? I am going to vote for not PLC, Palestinian Legislative Council, which is one of Oslo's institutions. The Palestinian Legislative Council is one of Oslo's institutions, and it represents only the Palestinians of the Gaza Strip and the West Bank. Whereas the PNC, the Palestine National Council, represents all Palestinians in Palestine and in the diaspora. Those are the elections that I'm going to join. Unfortunately, in May, only Palestinians of the Gaza Strip and the West Bank will be allowed to join. And this is why 39% have decided not to join the elections. Yes, Comrade Sia.
Okay. I'll take just quick questions from Comrade Firoza, who's saying, fantastic discussion. You have shared with us a perspective of the leaders and people that support normalization. Can you share with us an overview of the resistance movement today in Israel, West Bank, and in Gaza? And then there's a question from Sifundo. How does the US government play a role in sustaining apartheid Israel occupation of the Gaza? And you have 2 minutes to answer these, Comrade Haidar, and then we close. And then you can also share your closing remarks so that we can close, because I'm worried about time. And this thing might close us out.
Yeah. All right, I will do that. Look, I mean, you know, the term Sumud Firoza again, hello Firoza, my sister and comrade in arms Firoza. One of the other role models that I always admire. Look, there is, you know, the term Sumud. The mere fact that we exist and that we are steadfast in Gaza, that is resistance for us. What I'm doing right now with you, Firoza, and with my comrades in South Africa is a form of resistance. I am a BDS activist, and I have been one of the co-founders of the BDS movement in the Gaza Strip, which is, you know, part of the global BDS movement. We worked on, you know, the call issued in 2005, calling on the international community to boycott apartheid Israel. For me, popular resistance, headed by the BDS movement, the BNC, the Boycott National Committee. We also took part in the Great March of Return, you know, where we wanted to force Israel to implement United Nations Resolution 194, which calls for the return of all Palestinian refugees to the towns and villages from which they were ethnically cleansed back in 1948. And you know what happened during the Gaza, the Great March of Return. We all the time, we believe in civil disobedience and popular resistance. Now we think, and the topic of this webinar, we think that it is time for us to challenge the status quo controlled by the official leadership, right and left, secular and religious, which says that, you know, the two-state solution is the only solution here. And we are challenging that. We resist that by offering an alternative, by saying, look at South Africa. That is the solution for us here in Palestine, a secular democratic state in the historic land of Palestine. Sorry, that's the first part of it. You know, popular resistance on the ground on daily basis, BDS, and of course, I don't want to talk about other forms of resistance. I'm not part of the armed resistance, and in fact, there's no armed resistance at the moment. And this is why popular resistance is leading the pillars of struggle here in Palestine, in particular in Gaza. As for the United States of America, it's very well-known fact. America has been a strategic ally of apartheid Israel since its establishment in 1948. Every single time the Security Council comes with a resolution denouncing apartheid Israel, United States of America would veto that resolution. The supplier of arms, financial aid, financial supply that Israel is getting from the United States of America makes it the 52nd state of the United States of America. And all of us know how powerful the Israeli lobby in the United States of America. Everybody knows about the deal of the century by President Donald Trump, which gave Israel the right to occupy and colonize the entire historic land of Palestine. Thank you, Comrade Sia.
Thank you very much for that, Comrade Haidar, and thank you for taking your time and joining us in this conversation. You know, as I've said, it's lovely to have you here and to open up this first webinar of the Israel Apartheid Week with you. And so just to let all the comrades that are here, that this will be continuing, and this will be a continuing series. And then we have one discussion as well tomorrow that will be taking place in this particular platform. And I'm trying to find the time for it, because I can't seem to find it. But we're also continuing these webinars, and there's one tomorrow as well, here on this particular platform. But I've lost the screen now. But thank you very much, Comrade Haidar, and thank you very much to comrades. And sorry to the comrades who didn't speak. I see there's some hands here, and due to time, sorry we couldn't let you speak. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thanks.